Tonight, we dive into a world that was part theatre, part economics, and entirely Roman, the complex, regulated, and surprisingly sophisticated realm of Roman sex work. It wasn't just about quick transactions in shadowy corners. It was big business, political influence, and for some, the only path from slavery to freedom in an empire built on flesh, coin, and ambition. Now, dim the lights. Let the weight of history settle around you. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments. And let's step into the marble halls and narrow alleys of ancient Rome, where pleasure was a commodity and survival was an art. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Roman sex work. When most people imagine prostitution in ancient Rome, they picture desperate, powerless women huddled in filthy brothels, exploited by cruel masters and brutalized by drunken soldiers. They imagine a world of pure degradation, where sex workers were the lowest of the low, invisible and disposable. This image isn't entirely wrong, but it's catastrophically incomplete. Because while Rome certainly had its share of exploitation and misery, it also had something that would shock most modern observers: a thriving, regulated, and remarkably complex sex industry that offered some of the most sophisticated business opportunities available to women in the ancient world. In reality, Roman sex work existed on a spectrum that ranged from tragic to triumphant. At the bottom were the slaves and desperate freed women working in the cheapest lupanars, cramped, cell-like brothels where privacy meant a thin curtain and business was conducted on stone beds covered with straw mattresses. But at the top were the delicati and the grandes meretrices, elite courtesans who lived in luxury, commanded astronomical fees, and wielded influence that would make modern lobbyists envious. These weren't just women selling their bodies, they were entrepreneurs, entertainers, and power brokers who understood that in an empire obsessed with status and spectacle, sexuality was a form of currency more valuable than gold. Some owned property, maintained households of slaves, and invested in businesses across the Mediterranean. A few even influenced the decisions of emperors. Take Cytheris, for instance, not a mythical figure, but a real woman who started as an actress and courtesan, and ended up as the lover of Mark Antony himself. Or consider the unnamed meretrix mentioned in Martial's epigrams, who owned 3 villas and a fleet of ships that traded wine and olive oil from Gaul to Egypt. These women didn't stumble into wealth by accident. They built it, coin by careful coin, using the only tools Roman society allowed them to wield. The empire's attitude towards sex work was pragmatic to the point of being almost modern. Romans didn't moralize about prostitution the way later Christian societies would. To them, sexual desire was a biological fact, like hunger or thirst, and attempting to suppress it entirely was both futile and dangerous. Better to regulate it, tax it, and channel it in ways that served the state's interests. This led to one of history's most sophisticated systems of sexual commerce. Roman law recognized multiple categories of sex workers, each with different legal protections and social standing. There were the prostibula, the common prostitutes who worked in licensed brothels; the ambubia, Syrian flute players who provided musical entertainment and sexual services at private parties; the Kopi tavern girls who served wine and themselves with equal enthusiasm; and at the pinnacle, the delicati, refined courtesans who commanded fees equivalent to a soldier's annual salary for a single night. Each category operated under different rules, paid different taxes, and enjoyed different privileges. The system was so formalized that sex workers had their own guild, complete with patron deities, Venus naturally, but also Priapus, the well-endowed god of fertility and protection. They celebrated their own festivals, maintained their own temples, and even had their own system of professional standards and dispute resolution. The geography of Roman sex work was equally sophisticated. Every major city had designated red light districts where the trade was concentrated and regulated. In Rome itself, the Subura quarter buzzed with activity day and night, its narrow streets lined with lupanars, taverns and baths where business was conducted with remarkable efficiency. The Vicus Patricius offered more upscale establishments, while the area near the Circus Maximus catered to the sporting crowd with temporary stalls and mobile services during race days. But perhaps most shocking to modern sensibilities was how integrated sex work was into Roman religious life. Temple prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was considered sacred. The cult of Venus Erycina maintained temple courtesans who were believed to channel the goddess's divine sexuality. Wealthy Romans made offerings to these temples not just for spiritual favor, but for the opportunity to participate in sacred sexual rites that were thought to bring prosperity and fertility. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was sophisticated theology that recognized sexuality as a divine force worthy of reverence rather than shame. The Roman pantheon was filled with sexually active deities, from Mars's passionate affairs to Jupiter's legendary conquests. In a culture where gods regularly engaged in extramarital liaisons, human sexuality seemed natural rather than sinful. The economic reality was equally complex. While slaves obviously had no choice in their profession, a surprising number of sex workers were technically free women who had chosen the trade for economic reasons. In a society where respectable careers for women were limited to marriage, midwifery, or running small shops, prostitution offered unprecedented earning potential for those willing to accept the social stigma. Some women worked independently, renting small rooms and managing their own clientele. Others formed partnerships, sharing expenses and protection. The most successful established houses with multiple workers, essentially becoming madams who took a percentage of their employees' earnings while providing security, medical care and business connections. The clients were equally diverse. Contrary to popular imagination, Roman sex workers didn't just serve drunken legionnaires and debauched senators. Their clientele included merchants, artisans, slaves with savings, foreign diplomats, touring actors, and even women seeking discreet same-sex encounters. Some regulars formed long-term relationships that resembled marriages in everything but legal recognition, providing financial support, gifts, and emotional companionship that lasted for years. Records from Pompeii reveal the fascinating minutiae of this world. Graffiti on brothel walls includes not just crude propositions, but also tender declarations of love, business appointments, and even literary quotations. One inscription reads, "Restituta, you have a sweet soul," hardly the desperate scrawl of a brutalized victim. Another advertises Novellia Primigenia, from Nuceria, ask for whatever you want. The confident marketing of an entrepreneur who knew her worth. This complex reality challenges our assumptions about both ancient Rome and sex work itself. The Roman system wasn't perfect. Exploitation and abuse certainly existed, particularly among slaves and the desperate poor, but it also offered opportunities for agency, mobility, and even prosperity that were remarkable for any era, let alone the ancient world. In understanding this reality, we begin to see Roman sex workers not as history's victims, but as some of its most resourceful survivors. The Roman approach to regulating sex work would seem familiar to anyone who's ever dealt with modern business licensing, except instead of filing paperwork with the Department of Health, you registered with the aediles, the magistrates responsible for public morals and market regulation. And instead of worrying about zoning laws, you navigated a complex web of imperial edicts, municipal ordinances, and religious restrictions that could make or break your livelihood overnight. Unlike the Christian societies that would follow, Rome didn't ban prostitution. It institutionalized it. The Lex Iulia de Adulterius, passed under Augustus in 18 BCE, didn't criminalize sex work. Instead, it created legal categories that defined who could engage in it, where it could happen, and how much the state could tax it. This wasn't moral legislation. It was revenue generation disguised as public order. The registration process itself was deliberately humiliating, designed to ensure that women understood the social cost of their choice. A woman who wanted to work legally as a prostitute had to appear before the aediles and formally declare her intention. She stated her name, age, place of birth, and the fee she intended to charge, information that was recorded in public registers that anyone could consult. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was social marking. Once your name appeared in those ledgers, you were legally infamous, a designation that stripped away many civil rights and marked you permanently as a person of low character. The infamia wasn't just symbolic. It meant you couldn't marry a senator or anyone from the upper classes. You couldn't testify in court, except under torture. You couldn't inherit property from anyone outside your immediate family. Most cruelly, once you were registered as a prostitute, you could never fully escape that designation, even if you retired and married. Roman law assumed that once a woman had sold her body, she was forever tainted. But here's where Roman pragmatism created interesting loopholes. Wealthy women who wanted to engage in adultery without legal consequences would sometimes register as prostitutes temporarily, conduct their affairs, then attempt to withdraw from the profession. This became such a problem that Tiberius eventually banned women from registering if their grandfathers, fathers or husbands were of equestrian rank or higher. The law couldn't stop aristocratic women from having affairs, but it could prevent them from using prostitution laws as legal cover. The taxation system was equally systematic. Sex workers paid a specific tax called the lustral tax, collected every 5 years during the census. The amount varied based on location, status and declared income, but it was substantial, often equivalent to several months' earnings. This wasn't pocket change. It was a significant business expense that had to be calculated into pricing and budgeting. But the state also provided protections in exchange for these fees. Licensed prostitutes could appeal to magistrates if clients refused to pay, if they were assaulted, or if competitors tried to drive them out of business through intimidation. The courts weren't always sympathetic, but they were accessible. More than could be said for many other professions available to women. Local governments added their own layers of regulation. Cities designated specific districts where sex work was permitted, and others where it was banned entirely. The famous Suburra in Rome was essentially a red light district by law, not just custom. Residential areas, temples except those specifically dedicated to Venus, and markets were typically off limits. Violating these zoning restrictions could result in hefty fines and even temporary banishment from the city. Operating hours were also regulated. Most cities prohibited sex work during daylight hours on major religious festivals, and some banned it entirely during periods of public mourning or military crisis. The reasoning was partly religious. You couldn't have carnal activities competing with sacred observances, and partly practical. Authorities wanted to be able to quickly mobilize the population during emergencies without having to round up citizens from brothels. The empire also distinguished between different types of establishments. Lupanars, purpose-built brothels, operated under the strictest regulations. They required special licenses, regular inspections, and higher tax rates. But they also enjoyed certain protections. Other businesses couldn't operate within a specified distance, and competitors couldn't undercut prices below certain minimums. It was early monopoly regulation, designed to maintain stable markets rather than cutthroat competition. Thermopoliums, taverns that served food, wine, and sexual services, operated under different rules. They could serve alcohol and meals, but had to close during certain religious observances. Balnea, private baths that offered additional services, were regulated more like modern spas, with requirements for clean water, proper drainage, and medical inspections of workers. The most interesting category was the domus meretricia, private houses operated by elite courtesans. These weren't technically brothels but private residences where entertainment was provided to invited guests. The legal fiction allowed wealthy madams to avoid some of the stigma and taxation associated with commercial sex work, while still operating lucrative businesses. Authorities tolerated this arrangement as long as the operators were discreet and paid appropriate gifts to local officials. International commerce added another layer of complexity. Sex workers who traveled between cities had to register in each new location and pay local fees. Those who served foreign merchants or diplomats operated under special provisions that recognized the economic importance of keeping visiting traders happy. Some port cities even offered temporary licenses for women who arrived on trading ships, allowing them to work legally during their brief stays. The military created its own parallel system. Legionary camps couldn't officially include brothels. Moral reformers had seen to that, but they were invariably surrounded by vichy, civilian settlements that provided all the services soldiers needed, including sexual ones. The army turned a blind eye to these arrangements while maintaining official disapproval. It was institutional hypocrisy at its finest, allowing commanders to claim moral authority while ensuring their troops remained satisfied and manageable. Enforcement varied dramatically depending on local politics and personalities. Some magistrates strictly monitored compliance, conducting regular inspections and prosecuting violations aggressively. Others took a more relaxed approach, focusing on collecting taxes rather than moral policing. The emperor's personal attitudes also mattered. Augustus was relatively strict about sexual morality, while later emperors like Caligula and Nero were far more permissive. This legal framework created a strange paradox. Roman sex work was simultaneously heavily regulated and remarkably free. Women who accepted the legal and social consequences could operate legitimate businesses with genuine protections and opportunities for profit. But those same protections came with permanent stigma and reduced civil rights. It was a bargain that some women gladly accepted and one that others spent their entire careers trying to escape. To understand the true economic potential of Roman sex work, consider this. Clodia Pulchra, a freed woman who started as a slave in a Pompeii brothel, died owning 17 properties across 3 cities, a fleet of grain ships, and enough liquid capital to fund gladiatorial games in honor of her deceased patron. Her tomb inscription, discovered in 1887, lists her assets with the same pride that senators displayed their military victories. She wasn't unique. She was simply one of the few whose success was carved in stone. Roman sex work operated on an economic model that would impress modern venture capitalists. At its core was a simple principle: sexual desire was constant, universal, and renewable. Unlike other luxury goods that could be stockpiled or replicated, sexual services required the personal presence of the provider. This created natural scarcity that, when properly managed, translated into remarkable earning potential. The fee structure alone reveals the industry's sophistication. A basic encounter with a common prostitute in a Subura lupanar cost 2 asses, roughly equivalent to a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. But an evening with a skilled courtesan like Corinna, whose clients included senators and foreign ambassadors, commanded 400 denarii, more than a legionnaire's monthly salary. The difference wasn't just in physical beauty, it was in education, presentation, and exclusivity. Elite courtesans weren't just selling sex, they were selling experiences. They could discuss philosophy with Greek intellectuals, trade gossip with political wives, and provide the kind of sophisticated companionship that many marriages lacked. Some spoke multiple languages, having been educated alongside the children of their former masters. Others specialized in particular arts. Lydia of Rhodes was famous for her ability to compose erotic poetry on command, while Faustina the Younger could perform complex mathematical calculations while discussing military strategy, skills that fascinated intellectually starved clients. The investment required to reach these heights was substantial. A successful courtesan might spend the equivalent of a year's earnings on her wardrobe alone. Silk dresses imported from China, jewelry crafted by master artisans, cosmetics made from rare minerals, these weren't vanity purchases, but business expenses. Appearance was product, and luxury signaled value in ways that clients instinctively understood. Housing represented another major investment opportunity. The most successful sex workers didn't just rent rooms, they purchased entire buildings and converted them into sophisticated entertainment complexes. These domus included reception areas decorated with expensive frescoes, dining rooms for elaborate banquets, private baths with heated pools, and sleeping chambers furnished with imported furniture and exotic linens. Some featured gardens, libraries, and even small theaters where clients could enjoy private performances. Volumnia Prima, whose business record survived in the ash of Vesuvius, operated what was essentially an ancient entertainment conglomerate. Her establishment included 12 working women, a kitchen staff of 8, musicians, dancers, and even a resident physician. She owned the building, employed a doorkeeper and several armed guards, and maintained relationships with wine importers, textile merchants, and jewelers across the Mediterranean. Her annual income, calculated from preserved account books, exceeded that of many senators. The client relationship model was equally sophisticated. Rather than relying solely on walk-in trade, successful sex workers cultivated long-term patrons who provided regular income in exchange for exclusive access. These arrangements often resembled modern subscription services. A wealthy merchant might pay a monthly fee for priority booking, special rates, and first access to new services or accommodations. Some courtesans developed what we might now call vertical integration. They invested in the supply chains that supported their businesses, wine shops that provided refreshments for clients, textile workshops that created their clothing, even shipping companies that imported the luxury goods they needed for their establishments. Claudia Fortunata, a freedwoman who operated in Alexandria, owned shares in 3 different trading ventures and received quarterly dividends that supplemented her direct earnings. The geographic expansion opportunities were remarkable. Successful sex workers could franchise their operations, training other women and taking percentages of their earnings. Some established networks that stretched across multiple cities, allowing them to provide referrals for traveling clients and maintain income streams even when they couldn't work personally. Money management became a crucial skill. Roman banking was sophisticated but limited. and many sex workers developed their own financial strategies. Some invested in real estate, purchasing properties in growing cities and collecting rental income. Others became silent partners in legitimate businesses, taverns, bakeries, workshops, that provided diversified income and social respectability. A few even made loans to other sex workers, essentially becoming the industry's informal bankers. The retirement planning aspect was particularly innovative. Unlike other professions where workers aged out gradually, sex work had a sharp decline curve that required careful preparation. Smart courtesans began transitioning to management roles in their 30s, using their experience and connections to guide younger women while taking percentages of their earnings. Some became madams, others became marriage brokers, and a few transitioned entirely into legitimate businesses like running taverns or managing estates. International trade created additional opportunities. Roman sex workers who could cater to foreign merchants or diplomats often commanded premium rates and gained access to exotic goods that could be resold at substantial markups. Some learned foreign languages specifically to serve these markets, while others specialized in particular cultural preferences that visiting traders found appealing. The tax implications, while burdensome, also provided unexpected benefits. Because sex workers paid specific taxes and were registered with local authorities, they had legal standing to pursue business disputes, collect debts, and enter into contracts. This gave them access to Roman commercial law in ways that many other women couldn't access. Perhaps most remarkably, some sex workers used their earnings to purchase their own freedom and that of family members. Manumission was expensive, often costing several times a skilled worker's annual salary, but achievable for those who managed their careers strategically. Former slaves who bought their freedom could then become madams themselves, creating opportunities for other women while building legitimate business empires. The economic records that survive paint a picture of an industry that offered genuine upward mobility for those willing to accept its social costs. While the risks were real and the stigma permanent, the financial opportunities were unlike anything else available to women in the ancient world. In an empire built on commerce and ambition, sex work provided one of the few paths where a woman could accumulate real wealth, own property, and exercise genuine economic power. The Roman sex industry wasn't a single profession. It was an entire social ecosystem with its own rigid hierarchy, unwritten rules, and complex pathways for advancement. Understanding these distinctions is crucial because where you stood in this hierarchy determined not just your income but your living conditions, legal protections, and chances of survival. At the very bottom were the bustuaria, women who operated in cemeteries and burial grounds outside the city walls. These weren't licensed workers but desperate individuals who traded sex for scraps of food or small coins. They had no legal protection, no fixed location, and no social recognition whatsoever. Roman law didn't even acknowledge their existence, treating them as vagrants rather than workers. Most were former slaves who had been cast off by their owners, foreign refugees with no family connections, or women fleeing domestic violence with nowhere else to turn. The bustuaria worked at night among the tombs, serving the city's most desperate clients, escaped slaves, criminals, and men too poor or socially degraded to afford legitimate establishments. The setting was deliberate. Roman society associated these women with death and decay, placing them literally among the dead as a form of social quarantine. Few survived more than a few years in these conditions. One step above were the lupae, the common prostitutes who worked in the infamous lupanars of the Subura and other designated districts. The name itself meant she-wolves, a reference to both their supposed predatory nature and their connection to Lupa, the wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus. These women had legal status as registered sex workers, which provided minimal protections but also permanent social stigma. Lupe typically worked in small cell-like rooms, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a wash basin. The walls were often decorated with explicit frescoes advertising available services and prices, a form of ancient marketing that left little to the imagination. Most charged between 2 and 16 arses per encounter, depending on their age, appearance and the specific services requested. They kept roughly half their earnings, with the remainder going to the brothel owner, local taxes and basic expenses. The working conditions were harsh but regulated. Lupanars had to provide clean water for washing, basic medical care for common ailments and security against violent clients. The women typically worked 6 days a week, with religious festivals providing their only guaranteed time off. Most lived in small rooms above or behind their workplaces, creating communities of women who shared similar circumstances and challenges. Above the Lupe were the Ambube, Syrian and Eastern Mediterranean women who combined musical entertainment with sexual services. Originally temple musicians from the cults of Cybele and Atargata, they had brought their traditions to Rome and adapted them to Roman tastes. Ambube were known for their exotic dancing, flute playing, and knowledge of Eastern sexual techniques that Roman men found mysterious and alluring. These women commanded higher fees, typically 20 to 50 denarii per evening, and worked primarily at private parties and banquets. They weren't confined to specific brothels but moved freely throughout the city, accepting invitations to perform at wealthy households, political gatherings and military celebrations. Some maintained small apartments where they could entertain select clients privately, creating a bridge between common prostitution and elite courtesan services. The cope represented another specialized category. Tavern girls who served wine and provided sexual services in Thermopolia and Corpina throughout the empire. These establishments were part restaurant, part bar, and part brothel, serving the traveling merchants, sailors, and workers who formed the backbone of Roman commerce. Cope were often freed women who had invested their manumission savings in partnerships with tavern owners, giving them a stake in the business beyond just their sexual services. Working as a cope offered more security than street prostitution but required different skills. These women had to manage drunk customers, handle money, serve food and wine, and maintain the friendly, approachable demeanor that kept clients returning. Many developed long-term relationships with regular customers, creating a form of companionship that blended business with genuine affection. At the top of the hierarchy were the delicateurs and grandes meretrices, the elite courtesans who served senators, wealthy merchants, and occasionally even emperors. These women weren't just sexually skilled, they were cultural performers who could discuss literature, politics, and philosophy with equal facility. Many had been educated in Greek rhetoric, Roman law, or specialized arts like music and poetry. Elite courtesans maintained their own households, complete with slaves, freedmen, and various staff members. They owned expensive jewelry, fine clothing, and furnishings that rivaled those of aristocratic families. Some kept libraries, art collections, and even maintained patronage relationships with poets and artists. Their fees were astronomical, often several hundred denarii for a single evening, but they provided experiences that wealthy Romans couldn't find elsewhere. The most successful courtesans developed what we might call personal brands. Volumnia was known for her intellectual conversations and connections to Stoic philosophers. Cytheris specialized in theatrical performances and dramatic readings. Delia cultivated relationships with military commanders and became famous for her knowledge of campaign strategies and foreign cultures. Each carved out a specific niche that differentiated her from competitors. Between these major categories existed numerous subcategories and specializations. The quadrantarians were low-end prostitutes who charged a quadrans 1/4 of an as, and typically served slaves and the urban poor. The diabolaria charged 2 obols and catered to slightly better-off clients. The foria worked near the forum and specialized in quick encounters during business hours. The gallinai worked in bathhouses, the alicaria near temples, and the famosae were former actresses who traded on their celebrity status. Geographic location also determined status within each category. A cope working in Rome commanded higher fees than one in a provincial town. A courtesan operating in Alexandria or Antioch could charge more than her counterpart in Gaul or Britain. Access to wealthy clients, cultural amenities and luxury goods varied dramatically depending on where a woman practiced her profession. Mobility between these levels was possible but difficult. It required not just accumulating money but developing new skills, changing appearance, and often relocating to different cities where previous reputations wouldn't follow. Some women managed these transitions successfully, moving from street prostitution to tavern work to eventual independence as madams or business owners. Others found themselves trapped by circumstances, unable to accumulate the resources needed for advancement. This stratification system served multiple functions for Roman society. It provided clear social boundaries that maintained class distinctions while offering limited opportunities for advancement. It channeled sexual commerce into predictable patterns that authorities could monitor and tax. And it created a complex economy that supported not just sex workers themselves but also the landlords, suppliers, managers, and various service providers who depended on the industry for their livelihoods. In the marble corridors of Roman power, where senators debated the fate of provinces and generals planned their next conquests, some of the most influential voices belonged to women who officially didn't exist in the political sphere. These were the courtesans who had mastered the art of wielding power through proximity, using their intimate access to shape decisions that affected millions across the empire. The relationship between sex workers and political power in Rome was far more complex than simple transaction. Elite courtesans operated as unofficial political advisors, intelligence brokers, and influence peddlers in a system where women had no formal political rights but enormous informal influence. They occupied a unique position, trusted with the most private thoughts of powerful men while remaining outside the traditional networks of family obligation and political alliance that constrained other relationships. Consider the case of Praetia, a courtesan who became one of the most powerful women in late Republican Rome despite never holding any official position. Through her relationship with Cethegus, an influential senator, she essentially controlled access to one of Rome's most important political figures. Ambitious young men seeking Cethegus' support for magistracies or military commands learned quickly that the path to his favor ran through Praetia's drawing room. Praetia didn't just facilitate meetings, she actively shaped political outcomes. When Lucullus sought command of the war against Mithridates, Praetia's endorsement proved crucial in securing the necessary votes. She had studied the complex web of Senate politics, understood which senators held grudges against whom, and could predict how various proposals would be received. Her political intelligence was so valuable that some senators consulted her before major speeches or legislative initiatives. The mechanics of this influence were subtle but effective. Unlike wives or daughters who were bound by family loyalties and social expectations, courtesans could offer advice based purely on political calculation. They weren't invested in preserving family honor or maintaining traditional alliances. This gave them a kind of objectivity that traditional advisors couldn't provide, making their counsel particularly valuable during times of rapid political change. Elite courtesans also served as neutral ground for unofficial negotiations. When senators needed to explore compromises or test ideas without committing themselves publicly, they could meet at a courtesan's house under the pretext of social visits. These gatherings allowed for the kind of frank discussion that formal settings prohibited. Agreements hammered out over wine and intimacy often became the foundation for official legislation presented weeks later in the Senate. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of high-end sex workers were legendary. Men revealed secrets to their lovers that they would never share with political allies or family members. Courtesans learned about military plans, financial schemes, and personal scandals that could destroy careers or topple governments. The smart ones understood that information was more valuable than gold, but only if used carefully. Volumnia Cytheris, the freedwoman who became Mark Antony's longtime companion, exemplified this careful balance. She attended his war councils, travelled with him on campaigns, and was present during negotiations with foreign kings. Contemporary sources suggest she influenced his decisions about troop deployments, alliance negotiations, and even domestic policy. Yet she was careful never to appear to be giving orders or overstepping her position. Her influence was exercised through suggestion, timing, and the intimate conversations that occurred away from public scrutiny. Some courtesans specialized in particular types of political intelligence. Dilia the Alexandrian made herself indispensable by cultivating relationships with foreign ambassadors and trading companies. Through her network, she could provide early warnings about grain shortages, provincial rebellions, or barbarian movements beyond the frontier. This information was invaluable to senators involved in military planning or commercial ventures. Others focused on domestic intelligence, tracking the complex web of marriages, adoptions, and inheritance disputes that shaped Roman high society. Knowing which families were rising or falling, who was accumulating debts, and which young men were likely to receive major inheritances could inform everything from marriage negotiations to business partnerships. Courtesans who could provide this kind of social mapping found themselves with powerful and grateful clients. The relationship wasn't entirely one-sided. Politicians also used their courtesan connections to send messages and influence other powerful figures. If Senator Crassus wanted to communicate something to Senator Pompey without appearing to negotiate directly, he might share his thoughts with a courtesan who was known to entertain Pompey's associates. The message would travel through these informal networks, allowing for deniability while still achieving the desired communication. Imperial politics created even more opportunities for courtesan influence. Emperors, surrounded by suspicious relatives and potentially treacherous advisors, often found companionship with women who had no independent power base and therefore posed no direct threat. These relationships could become deeply influential over time. Acte, a freedwoman who became Nero's longtime lover, exercised considerable influence over imperial policy during her years of favor. She advocated for particular artistic projects, influenced appointments to cultural positions, and even weighed in on legal cases involving freedmen and slaves. While she never held official power, her proximity to the emperor made her one of the most influential women in the empire. The financial aspects of these political relationships were equally complex. Successful courtesans often invested their earnings in ways that created ongoing connections to political figures. They might provide loans to ambitious young senators, fund gladiatorial games or public works projects, or purchase properties that could be used for political entertaining. These investments created networks of obligation and mutual interest that extended far beyond sexual relationships. Some courtesans used their political connections to advocate for specific causes or communities. Freedwomen often championed the interests of other former slaves, using their influence to secure better legal protections or challenge particularly abusive masters. Foreign-born courtesans sometimes served as informal ambassadors for their home regions, providing information about local conditions and advocating for favorable treatment in trade negotiations. The system had its dangers. Courtesans who became too closely associated with particular political factions could find themselves targeted when power shifted. During the proscriptions that followed various civil wars, some courtesans were executed or exiled not for their own actions but because of their associations with defeated political leaders. The intimate knowledge that made them valuable also made them dangerous witnesses who couldn't be allowed to survive political transitions. Yet despite these risks, the system persisted because it served essential functions that formal political institutions couldn't provide. In a society where women had no official political voice, courtesans created informal channels for feminine influence. In a system where personal relationships determined political outcomes, they provided access and intelligence that traditional alliances couldn't supply. They were the shadow diplomats of the Roman world, wielding influence through intimacy in an empire built on personal power and private connection. To understand Roman attitudes towards sex work, you must first understand that the Romans saw sexuality as a divine force, not something shameful to be hidden, but a sacred power that connected mortals to the gods themselves. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was sophisticated theology that treated sexual energy as a manifestation of cosmic creativity, worthy of reverence, ritual, and institutional support. The most striking example was the cult of Venus Erycina, whose temple on the Aventine Hill housed hierarchies, sacred prostitutes who were considered living embodiments of the goddess's erotic power. These weren't ordinary sex workers who happened to operate near a temple. They were consecrated religious officials whose sexual services were considered sacramental acts that channeled divine energy to worshippers. The hierarchies underwent elaborate initiation ceremonies that included ritual purification, sacred tattooing, and formal dedication to Venus. They wore distinctive clothing, often diaphanous silk gowns dyed with expensive purple that marked their sacred status, and lived within the temple complex in quarters decorated with frescoes depicting the goddess's various mythological encounters. Their daily routines included morning prayers, ritual bathing in perfumed water, and careful preparation of their bodies and minds for their sacred duties. Clients didn't simply purchase sexual services from hierarchies. They participated in religious ceremonies that included offerings to Venus, recitation of prescribed prayers, and ritual purification both before and after their encounters. The sexual act itself was understood as a form of communion with the divine, a temporary merger of human and goddess that brought blessings of fertility, prosperity, and divine favor. The economics of temple prostitution were equally sacred. Payment wasn't a simple transaction, but a religious offering made to the goddess through her earthly representatives. These offerings supported not just the hierarchies themselves, but the entire temple infrastructure, priests, maintenance staff, musicians, and the elaborate festivals that marked important points in Venus's ritual calendar. During the Veneralia, celebrated each April, the temple became the center of citywide festivities that blended religious devotion with sexual celebration. Married women came to pray for harmony in their households, while unmarried men sought the goddess's blessing for future romantic success. The hierarchies performed sacred dances, participated in ritual processions through the city, and offered their services to specially selected worshippers chosen through religious divination. But Venus Erycina wasn't the only deity associated with sacred sexuality. The cult of Cybele, the Great Mother imported from Asia Minor, included Galli, priests who had undergone ritual castration and often engaged in sexual practices that challenged conventional Roman gender roles. During the festival of Megalesia, these priests performed ecstatic dances and offered various forms of sexual blessing to devotees seeking the goddess's favor. The Syrian goddess Atargates maintained her own temple prostitutes, known as Kadashim, who specialized in fertility rituals and sacred marriages. These ceremonies were particularly popular among merchants and traders, who sought divine protection for their business ventures. The sexual union with a Kadash was believed to guarantee the goddess's ongoing favor, ensuring successful voyages and profitable transactions. Even Priapus, the famously well-endowed god of fertility and protection, had associated cult prostitutes who worked at shrines throughout the empire. These devotees were often stationed at crossroads, harbor entrances and city gates, liminal spaces where Priapus's protective power was considered most necessary. Their services were believed to channel the god's virility, offering protection against the evil eye, ensuring safe travels, and promoting general prosperity. The theological justification for these practices was sophisticated and internally consistent. Roman religion understood the gods as actively sexual beings who regularly engaged in affairs, marriages, and various erotic adventures. Jupiter's numerous conquests, Mars's passionate relationships, and Venus's endless romantic entanglements weren't seen as moral failings, but as expressions of divine creativity and power. If the gods themselves were sexual beings, then human sexuality became a way of participating in divine nature. This perspective influenced how Romans understood the difference between sacred and secular sex work. Sacred prostitutes were performing religious duties that connected the community to divine power. Secular prostitutes were providing physical services that met human needs. Both were legitimate, but they served different functions and operated under different moral frameworks. The distinction had practical implications. Sacred prostitutes enjoyed higher social status than their secular counterparts. They couldn't be forced into marriage against their will, couldn't be punished for adultery since their sexual activity was religious duty, and often accumulated considerable wealth through religious offerings. Some became influential figures in their own right, serving as advisors to political leaders or wealthy merchants who sought divine guidance for important decisions. The training for sacred prostitution was extensive and specialized. Hierarchies learned not just sexual techniques but also theology, ritual procedures, divine music, and sacred poetry. They studied the mythological stories associated with their deities, memorized the proper prayers and invocations for different ceremonies, and mastered the complex choreography of religious festivals. Many became accomplished musicians, dancers, and storytellers whose performances were considered forms of worship in themselves. Foreign visitors to Rome were often shocked by the openness of these religious practices. Greek intellectuals, despite their own traditions of sacred prostitution in places like Corinth, found the Roman integration of sexuality and state religion surprisingly thorough. Jewish and early Christian observers condemned the practices as immoral, but their criticisms often revealed their own fascination with the sophisticated theology that supported sacred sexuality. The imperial government's attitude toward temple prostitution was typically pragmatic. These institutions generated substantial tax revenue, attracted foreign visitors who spent money in Roman cities, and provided religious services that helped maintain social stability. As long as the temples supported imperial authority and didn't challenge state policies, they were allowed to operate with considerable autonomy. Some emperors even participated personally in these religious practices. Caligula notoriously spent enormous sums on temple prostitutes, claiming that his encounters with them gave him direct access to divine wisdom. While his behavior was widely criticized as excessive, the underlying principle that sexual communion with sacred prostitutes could provide religious insight was accepted as theologically sound. The decline of sacred prostitution began with the rise of Christianity as the dominant imperial religion. Christian emperors like Constantine began restricting temple practices, closing certain shrines and redirecting religious funding toward Christian institutions. But the transition took centuries, and many sacred prostitution practices continued in modified forms well into the late imperial period. The Roman integration of sexuality and religion created a unique cultural space where sex work could be understood as divine service rather than merely commercial transaction. This elevated certain forms of prostitution beyond simple economic activity, making them part of the empire's spiritual infrastructure and demonstrating the sophisticated ways that Roman society understood the connections between human desire and cosmic power. The morning routine of Faustina, a courtesan operating near the Forum Boarium, began before dawn with a ritual that would be familiar to any modern service worker preparing for a demanding day. She bathed in heated water perfumed with rose oil, carefully applied cosmetics made from lead powder and antimony, and selected her clothing based on her expected clientele. But unlike other Roman women, every choice she made, from the style of her hair to the scent of her perfume, was a business decision that could determine whether she earned enough to eat well that day or went to bed hungry. Living conditions for Roman sex workers varied dramatically based on their position in the industry hierarchy, but even the most successful faced challenges that would shock modern observers. Most lupae, common prostitutes, lived in small chambers above or behind their workplaces, spaces barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a chest for personal belongings. These rooms had no windows to the street, only small openings high on the walls that provided minimal light and ventilation. Privacy was non-existent. Thin wooden partitions separated one room from another, and the sounds of business transactions were audible throughout the building. The daily schedule was relentless. Most brothels opened at dawn and operated until well after sunset, with workers expected to be available whenever clients appeared. A typical lupanar might see 50 to 60 customers per day across all its workers, with individual women servicing anywhere from 5 to 15 clients depending on their popularity and the day's traffic. The encounters were brief, typically lasting 15 to 30 minutes, and rigidly practical. There was no time for extended conversation or elaborate preparation between clients. Hygiene presented constant challenges. While Roman cities had sophisticated aqueduct systems, most brothels had limited access to fresh water. Workers relied on ceramic basins filled once or twice daily, and cleaning between clients often involved nothing more than a quick rinse with wine or vinegar, both for their antiseptic properties and ready availability. Soap was expensive and reserved for evening baths when the day's work was complete. The combination of limited washing facilities and frequent physical activity in poorly ventilated spaces created aromatic challenges that workers addressed with heavy perfumes and frequent clothing changes. Food was another daily concern. Lower-tier sex workers typically ate one substantial meal per day, usually in the evening after work ended. This might consist of bread, cheese, olives, and wine, the standard diet of Rome's working poor. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days or when earnings had been particularly good. Many brothels had arrangements with nearby taverns to provide meals, often at inflated prices that further reduced workers' actual earnings. Safety was a perpetual worry that shaped every aspect of daily life. While licensed brothels employed doorkeepers and security staff, violence remained a constant threat. Clients sometimes became aggressive when drunk, refused to pay agreed-upon fees, or demanded services that workers were unwilling to provide. The legal system offered limited protection. While assault was technically illegal, prosecuting clients required witnesses and often resulted in more trouble than justice. Most establishments developed informal security protocols. Workers used coded signals to alert colleagues when clients became threatening. Some kept small knives or other weapons concealed in their rooms. The more successful brothels employed former gladiators or military veterans as security, but their presence was expensive and not always effective against well-connected clients who felt entitled to treat sex workers however they pleased. The clientele itself was remarkably diverse, challenging modern assumptions about who used prostitution services in ancient Rome. While popular imagination focuses on drunken soldiers and debauched aristocrats, the reality was far more mundane. Typical clients included unmarried young men from merchant families, married men whose wives were pregnant or unavailable, foreign visitors to the city, slaves and freedmen with modest savings, and even women seeking discreet same-sex encounters. Many clients were regulars who developed ongoing relationships with particular workers. Marcus Tullius, a freedman who operated a small bakery near the Circus Maximus, visited the same courtesan every week for 3 years, bringing her pastries and discussing his business concerns as much as seeking sexual services. These relationships often blurred the lines between commercial transaction and genuine companionship, providing emotional support that was as valuable as physical intimacy. The emotional toll of the work was something that Roman sources rarely discussed directly, but evidence survives in graffiti, letters, and tomb inscriptions. Many sex workers developed close friendships with their colleagues, creating substitute families that provided support and protection in an often hostile world. Some formed romantic relationships with clients or other workers, though these were complicated by the professional nature of their daily interactions. Seasonal variations significantly affected daily life. Winter brought reduced traffic, as traveling merchants stayed home and locals spent less time away from their hearths. This meant lower earnings precisely when heating costs and food prices were highest. Summer brought increased business but also greater health risks as poor ventilation and limited sanitation created breeding grounds for disease. Spring and fall were typically the most profitable seasons, when weather was pleasant and commercial activity peaked. Disease was an ever-present concern that shaped daily routines and long-term planning. While Romans lacked modern understanding of sexually transmitted infections, they recognized that certain symptoms appeared frequently among sex workers and their clients. Some used rudimentary prophylactics made from animal bladders or linen soaked in various substances. Others relied on herbal remedies, magic amulets, or prayers to Venus for protection. The most successful sex workers developed sophisticated strategies for managing these daily challenges. They cultivated relationships with reliable clients who provided steady income and some measure of protection. They invested in better living quarters when possible, often sharing expenses with other workers to afford safer, more comfortable accommodations. Some formed business partnerships that allowed them to specialize in particular services or clientele while sharing resources and security. Despite the hardships, many workers found ways to create meaning and dignity in their daily lives. They participated in religious festivals, maintained friendships, and sometimes even raised children with the help of their professional communities. Some learned to read and write, acquired business skills, or developed artistic talents that provided alternative sources of income and personal satisfaction. The daily reality of Roman sex work was neither the degraded misery that moralists described, nor the glamorous adventure that modern entertainment suggests. It was hard, often dangerous work that required physical stamina, emotional resilience, and business acumen. For many women, it represented the best available option for economic independence in a society that offered few alternatives. The fact that they not only survived but sometimes thrived under these conditions speaks to remarkable resourcefulness and strength. The story of Claudia Metrodora, carved into her marble tomb outside Aquae Sulis, tells of a remarkable transformation that would have seemed impossible to those who knew her origins. Here lies Claudia Metrodora, beloved wife of Marcus Antonius Rufus, generous patron of the temple restoration, mother to 5 children, grandmother to 12. What the inscription doesn't mention, though everyone in the city knew, was that Metrodora had spent 15 years as one of Rome's most expensive courtesans before purchasing a villa, marrying a respected merchant, and becoming one of the town's most influential matrons. Retirement from sex work wasn't just about aging out of the profession, it was about executing a carefully planned escape strategy that some women began developing from their very first day in the trade. The smart ones understood that youth and beauty were temporary assets that had to be converted into permanent wealth, social connections, and alternative identities before time ran out. The most common retirement path was gradual transition to management roles within the industry itself. Successful courtesans often invested their earnings in purchasing or leasing brothels, becoming madams who supervised younger workers while taking percentages of their earnings. This provided continuing income streams that weren't dependent on personal sexual services, while leveraging their experience and connections to build sustainable businesses. Volumnia Prima exemplified this approach. After working as a courtesan for 12 years, she used her savings to purchase a small lupanar in the Subura, gradually expanding it into one of Rome's most profitable establishments. She employed 18 women, maintained connections with wine merchants and textile suppliers, and even operated a small money-lending business that served both sex workers and their clients. By age 40, she owned 3 buildings and had enough capital to purchase citizenship for her daughter and sponsor her marriage to a minor magistrate's son. Property investment represented another crucial retirement strategy. Real estate provided both immediate rental income and long-term wealth accumulation that could support women after their working years ended. Some courtesans purchased small apartments that they rented to other sex workers, creating steady income while providing housing for women in the same profession. Others invested in commercial properties, shops, taverns, workshops that generated diversified revenue streams. The geographic mobility that sex work required often created opportunities for reinvention. A courtesan who had become too well known in Rome could relocate to a provincial city where her past was unknown, using her accumulated wealth to establish herself as a respectable widow or freed woman. Some moved to frontier towns where social scrutiny was less intense and entrepreneurial opportunities more abundant. Livia Fortunata followed this path, using her earnings from a decade in Alexandria to relocate to Lugdunum in Gaul, where she purchased a large inn that catered to traveling merchants. Her education, language skills, and understanding of diverse cultures, all developed during her courtesan years, made her exceptionally suited for the hospitality business. Within 5 years, she owned 3 inns and had married a local wine merchant who valued her business acumen more than her past profession. Marriage represented the most challenging but potentially rewarding escape route. While Roman law prohibited marriages between registered prostitutes and citizens of high rank, it didn't prevent unions with freedmen, foreign merchants, or lower-class citizens. Some courtesans developed genuine romantic relationships with long-term clients who were willing to provide financial support in exchange for exclusive companionship. The key was timing and presentation. Women had to retire from active sex work before proposing marriage, often using accumulated wealth to purchase respectability through charitable donations, religious dedications, or public works projects. Some underwent ritual purification ceremonies or made pilgrimages to distant temples as symbolic breaks with their former lives. Financial planning required sophisticated understanding of Roman monetary systems and investment opportunities. Successful courtesans often became skilled money managers, learning to navigate currency exchanges, property laws, and tax obligations. Some provided informal banking services to other sex workers, offering loans, currency exchange, and financial advice that helped build networks of mutual support. Domitia Lucilla developed one of the most innovative retirement strategies on record. Using her connections with foreign merchants, she established an import business that brought silk and spices from the East to Roman markets. Her cultural knowledge and language skills, developed through years of entertaining diverse clientele, gave her unique advantages in international commerce. She eventually became wealthy enough to endow a school for freedmen's children and was honored with a public statue in the forum of her adopted city. Some women used their intimate knowledge of Roman politics and society to become professional marriage brokers or social facilitators. Their understanding of family networks, financial situations, and personal relationships made them valuable intermediaries for arranging marriages, business partnerships, and social alliances among the merchant and freedman classes. The most successful retirement transitions often involve developing alternative identities that built upon skills acquired during sex work years. Courtesans who had learned to read and write sometimes became scribes or record keepers. Those with musical or artistic talents opened schools or workshops. Some who had developed medical knowledge through necessity became midwives or healers. Religious conversion provided another pathway to respectability. The mystery cults that flourished throughout the empire often welcomed former sex workers as proof of their transformative power. Some women became priestesses or temple attendants, using their accumulated wealth to support religious institutions in exchange for new social identities and community acceptance. The children of sex workers presented particular challenges and opportunities for social mobility. While legally these children inherited their mother's low status, wealth could overcome many social barriers. Some courtesans sent their children to be raised by relatives in distant cities, providing financial support while concealing the source of their income. Others openly acknowledged their children but used their wealth to ensure excellent educations and advantageous marriages. Legal manumission represented a crucial step for those who had been slaves. The process was expensive, often costing several years' earnings, but it provided essential legal protections and opened doors to property ownership, legal marriage, and business partnerships. Some madams made manumission loans to their workers, creating systems of indentured servitude that eventually led to freedom. The most remarkable aspect of these retirement strategies was how they transformed individual survival tactics into broader social change. As former sex workers became property owners, business operators, and community leaders, they created new opportunities for other women and challenged traditional assumptions about female capabilities and social mobility. Not every woman succeeded in escaping sex work or elevating her status. Many aged out of the profession without adequate savings, finding themselves dependent on charity or forced into less lucrative work. Others fell victim to theft, bad investments, or economic downturns that wiped out their accumulated wealth. But enough succeeded that retirement and social mobility became realistic goals that motivated women throughout their working careers. The stories of successful transitions reveal something remarkable about Roman society. Despite its rigid social hierarchies and moral prejudices, it remained sufficiently fluid that determined individuals could sometimes transcend their origins through careful planning, strategic thinking, and sheer persistence. The women who achieved these transformations didn't just escape their circumstances, they redefined what was possible for others who followed. When we think of Roman sex work, we typically imagine women, but this blindness to male prostitution reveals one of our most significant misconceptions about ancient sexuality. Roman men sold sexual services just as commonly as women, operating in a parallel industry that was simultaneously more accepted and more dangerous, more profitable and more precarious than female prostitution. The legal framework for male sex work was notably different from its female counterpart. While women who registered as prostitutes lost many civil rights permanently, men faced fewer long-term legal consequences, but only if they maintained strict control over their sexual roles. Roman masculinity was built around the concept of sexual dominance, and a man who was perceived as taking the passive role in sexual encounters faced social destruction that could follow him for life. This created a complex hierarchy among male sex workers that was even more rigid than the stratification among women. At the top were the spintree, elite male courtesans who served wealthy Roman women and foreign visitors. These men were often exceptionally handsome, well-educated, and skilled in the arts of conversation, music, and dance. They commanded enormous fees and enjoyed social privileges that female courtesans could rarely match. Gaius Valerius Catamitus, whose career was documented by several contemporary sources, exemplified the spintree lifestyle. Born a slave in a senatorial household, he was educated alongside his master's children and trained in Greek rhetoric, philosophy, and poetry. His exceptional beauty and intelligence earned him manumission at age 20, after which he established himself as one of Rome's most sought-after male companions. His clientele included senators' wives, wealthy widows, and visiting foreign queens who paid premium rates for his services. The spintree operated differently from female courtesans in crucial ways. Because Roman society expected men to be sexually dominant, these male sex workers had to perform a careful balancing act, providing sexual services while maintaining the appearance of masculine control. Many specialized in serving foreign women who came from cultures with different sexual expectations, or Roman women who sought experiences unavailable in their traditional marriages. Below the spintree were the common male prostitutes who worked in taverns, baths, and specialized establishments throughout the empire. These men, known as prostituti or katamiti, faced much harsher social stigma than their female counterparts because their work was seen as fundamentally unmanning. Roman culture could accept a woman selling her body. It was degrading but not gender transgressive. A man who allowed himself to be sexually used by others, however, was seen as abandoning his essential masculine nature. The bathhouses represented the largest market for male sex work. Roman bathing culture created numerous opportunities for sexual encounters, and many bath attendants supplemented their legitimate wages through prostitution. These massators offered muscle rubs that frequently included sexual services, operating in a grey area between legitimate business and prostitution that provided plausible deniability for both workers and clients. Military camps created another significant market for male sex workers. While Roman law technically prohibited homosexual activities among soldiers, enforcement was inconsistent and demand was constant. Young men who followed the legions often provided sexual services along with other camp necessities like laundry, cooking, and equipment maintenance. Some developed long-term relationships with officers or wealthy soldiers, receiving protection and financial support in exchange for exclusive sexual access. The gladiatorial schools produced some of the most expensive male sex workers in the empire. Gladiators were already sex symbols to Roman audiences, admired for their physical prowess and exotic danger. Some supplemented their arena earnings by providing sexual services to wealthy patrons who were fascinated by their combination of strength and vulnerability. These arrangements were often formalized through contracts that specified when and how the gladiators' sexual services could be accessed. Foreign men brought different opportunities and challenges to Roman sex work. Germanic and Celtic slaves, prized for their fair coloring and exotic appearance, often commanded premium prices from Roman clients seeking novel experiences. Greek men traded on their reputations for intellectual sophistication and sexual technique. Egyptian and Syrian males offered expertise in Eastern erotic practices that Romans found mysterious and alluring. The religious aspects of male sex work were particularly complex. While some temples employed male prostitutes alongside their female counterparts, the Galli castrated priests of Cybele occupied a unique position that was simultaneously sacred and sexually available, serving clients who sought communion with the goddess through encounters with her gender-transformed servants. The economic opportunities for male sex workers were substantial but came with unique risks. Successful spintree could accumulate wealth comparable to female courtesans, but they faced constant threats to their reputations that could destroy their careers instantly. Accusations of passive sexual behavior could result in social exile, legal disabilities, and even physical violence from clients or competitors seeking to damage their standing. The aging process presented different challenges for male sex workers. While female courtesans could transition to management roles or marriage, men faced fewer acceptable exit strategies. Some became trainers for younger male prostitutes, using their experience to teach newcomers the complex navigation of Roman sexual politics. Others transitioned into legitimate businesses, often using their accumulated wealth and social connections to establish themselves in trade or crafts. The client base for male sex workers was more diverse than historical sources typically acknowledge. While wealthy Roman women formed an important market, men also served male clients seeking experiences that were socially acceptable as long as proper roles were maintained. Foreign visitors, particularly from cultures with different sexual norms, represented another significant clientele. Some men specialized in particular types of encounters. Those skilled in passive roles commanded high fees from certain clients despite the social risks involved. Documentation of male sex work is frustratingly incomplete, partly because Roman historians focused primarily on female prostitution, and partly because male sex workers faced greater social pressure to conceal their activities. What evidence survives in graffiti, legal documents, and literary references suggests an industry that was both substantial and carefully hidden from public scrutiny. The social mobility available to male sex workers was limited, but not non-existent. Some former prostitutes used their earnings and connections to establish legitimate businesses, often in industries where their sexual past was less relevant. Others married into merchant families or became clients themselves, using their accumulated wealth to purchase respectability. A few exceptional individuals even achieved political influence, though they had to navigate carefully to avoid having their sexual histories used against them. The double standards governing male and female sex work reveal fundamental contradictions in Roman sexual culture. While the empire celebrated masculine sexual dominance, it created substantial markets for male sexual submission. While it stigmatized men who sold their bodies, it rewarded those who did so successfully with wealth and access to elite social circles. These contradictions created opportunities for some men while destroying others, making male sex work simultaneously one of ancient Rome's most profitable and most dangerous professions. The smell hit you first when entering the Officina Medica near the Subura, a mixture of vinegar, burning herbs and something sharper that veterans of the district recognized as the distinctive odor of treatments for the venous sickness. This small clinic, operated by a Greek freedman named Asclepios, served a clientele that legitimate physicians often refused to treat the sex workers of Rome's busiest red-light district. Roman medicine understood little about the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, but physicians and sex workers alike recognized patterns that modern medicine would later explain through germ theory. They observed that certain symptoms, painful urination, genital sores, and unusual discharge, appeared frequently among those who engaged in commercial sex, and they developed treatments that, while often ineffective, represented sophisticated attempts to manage public health in an era without antibiotics. The most feared condition was what Romans called ignasaza, sacred fire, a painful condition that caused burning sensations and lesions around the genitals. Modern medical historians believe this was likely gonorrhea, though syphilis may have existed in different forms than we recognize today. Sex workers learned to recognize early symptoms and sought treatment immediately, not just for their own comfort, but because clients would refuse services from anyone showing visible signs of disease. Treatment protocols varied widely depending on the practitioner and the patient's ability to pay. Wealthy courtesans could afford consultations with trained physicians who prescribed complex remedies involving mercury, lead compounds, and various herbal mixtures. These treatments were often worse than the diseases themselves. Mercury poisoning caused tooth loss, tremors, and eventually death, while lead-based medicines resulted in mental deterioration and organ failure. Common prostitutes relied on folk remedies passed down through generations of sex workers. They used douches made from wine and vinegar, applied poultices of crushed garlic and honey to external sores, and consumed herbal teas believed to purify the blood. Some of these treatments had genuine medical value. Vinegar's acidity did provide some antimicrobial effect, and certain herbs contained compounds that modern medicine recognizes as anti-inflammatory agents. The larger brothels often employed resident healers who specialized in the medical problems of sex workers. These practitioners, usually freedmen or women with some medical training, developed expertise in treating conditions that mainstream physicians preferred to ignore. They performed basic surgery to remove growths or cysts, provided contraceptive advice, and maintained supplies of medicines specifically formulated for the trade's most common ailments. Pregnancy presented unique challenges in an industry where fertility could destroy earning potential. Roman contraceptive methods were unreliable but widely used among sex workers. They employed pessaries made from wool soaked in honey and various acidic substances, drank herbal concoctions believed to prevent conception, and practiced forms of rhythm method based on lunar cycles and body temperature observations. When contraception failed, abortion became necessary for economic survival. Roman law permitted abortion during early pregnancy, and several practitioners in each major city specialized in terminating unwanted pregnancies. The procedures were dangerous. Infections, hemorrhaging, and death were common complications, but many sex workers considered them preferable to the economic devastation of unwanted childbirth. Sabina the Syrian, who operated near the port of Ostia, became famous throughout the region for her abortion techniques. Using a combination of herbal medicines and mechanical intervention, She claimed a survival rate that attracted clients from across the Mediterranean. Her methods, documented in papyrus fragments discovered in Egypt, included detailed instructions for post-procedure care that suggest surprisingly sophisticated understanding of infection prevention. Mental health challenges were largely unrecognized, but clearly present in ancient sources. The stress of dangerous work, social stigma, and constant fear of violence took psychological tolls that Roman medicine had no framework for understanding. Some sex workers turned to alcohol or opium-based drugs to cope with depression and anxiety, creating additional health problems that compounded their difficulties. Religious healing played a significant role in medical care for sex workers. Temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing, welcomed sex workers alongside other patients seeking divine intervention for their ailments. The temple on Tiber Island maintained a hospital that provided both medical treatment and spiritual healing for those suffering from venereal diseases, operating on the principle that physical and spiritual purification were equally necessary for recovery. The cult of Isis also attracted sex workers seeking healing and spiritual renewal. Isis was associated with feminine power and protection, making her particularly appealing to women in vulnerable professions. Some temples offered ritual purification ceremonies that were believed to cleanse both body and soul of the spiritual pollution associated with commercial sex. Seasonal health patterns affected the entire industry. Summer brought increased business but also greater disease transmission as heat and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for bacterial growth. Winter reduced sexual activity, but increased respiratory infections and other illnesses associated with poor heating and nutrition. Spring cleaning rituals in brothels often included fumigation with sulfur and other substances believed to purify the air and prevent disease transmission. Dental care represented a constant challenge for sex workers, whose appearance directly affected their earning potential. Romans understood the importance of clean teeth and fresh breath, but dental hygiene was difficult to maintain under brothel conditions. Many sex workers chewed mint leaves, rinsed with wine, and used abrasive powders to clean their teeth, though these methods often caused more damage than benefit. Skin care was equally crucial, as blemishes, rashes, or signs of aging could severely impact a sex worker's market value. They used various cosmetics and treatments to maintain youthful appearances, lead-based face powders, antimony eye makeup, and rouge made from crushed insects or minerals. These cosmetics often contained toxic substances that caused long-term health problems, but the immediate economic benefits outweighed concerns about future consequences. The most successful sex workers invested significantly in their health care, understanding that their bodies were their primary business assets. Elite courtesans employed personal physicians, maintained stocks of expensive medicines, and followed elaborate health regimens that included special diets, regular exercise, and preventive treatments designed to maintain their appearance and fertility. Some establishments developed innovative approaches to health management. The House of the Golden Cupids in Pompeii included a small medical facility with surgical instruments, medicine jars, and examination areas. The proprietress, Julia Felix, maintained detailed records of her workers' health status and required regular medical examinations as a condition of employment. Professional medical networks gradually developed around the sex trade. Physicians who specialized in venereal diseases often worked exclusively with sex workers and their clients, developing expertise that mainstream medicine lacked. These practitioners shared information about effective treatments, collaborated on difficult cases, and gradually built a body of medical knowledge specifically focused on sexually transmitted conditions. The relationship between sex workers and the medical establishment was complex and often adversarial. While some physicians provided compassionate care, others exploited their patients' vulnerability, charging excessive fees for ineffective treatments or refusing emergency care during medical crises. This led many sex workers to develop mutual aid networks, pooling resources to pay for medical care and sharing knowledge about effective treatments and trustworthy practitioners. Walking through the narrow, winding streets of the Subura at dusk, a visitor would immediately understand why this district had become synonymous with vice throughout the Roman world. The streets were barely wide enough for two people to pass, creating an intimate maze where anonymity was guaranteed and escape routes were plentiful. But this wasn't accidental urban development, it was careful planning that served the needs of an industry that required both accessibility and discretion. Roman city planners understood that sex work needed dedicated spaces that were integrated into urban life while remaining contained enough to prevent moral contamination of respectable neighborhoods. This led to the development of specialized red light districts that became models for similar zones throughout the empire. The Subura wasn't just a poor neighborhood that happened to attract prostitutes. It was deliberately designed to serve as Rome's primary sexual commerce hub. The district's location was strategically chosen. Positioned between the Forum and the residential areas on the Palatine and Esquiline hills, it was easily accessible to clients from all social classes while remaining physically separated from the most prestigious neighborhoods. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, ran directly beneath the district, providing essential sanitation for businesses that generated substantial human waste. Fresh water from the Aqua Marcia aqueduct supplied the numerous bathhouses and brothels that required constant cleaning. The architecture of Roman brothels was surprisingly standardized across the empire, suggesting either official building codes or widespread copying of successful designs. Typical lupanars featured a central corridor with small rooms, cellae, opening on either side. Each room contained a stone bed covered with a straw mattress, a small wash basin, and wall frescoes depicting various sexual acts that served as advertising for available services. The entrance areas were designed for maximum commercial efficiency. Clients entered through a narrow doorway that led to a reception area where prices were negotiated and payment collected in advance. This space typically featured more elaborate decorations, colorful frescoes, oil lamps, and sometimes small shrines to Venus or Priapus for divine protection. The layout ensured that business transactions occurred quickly and discreetly, minimizing the time clients spent in public areas where they might be recognized. Privacy, however, was relative. The stone walls between rooms were thin enough that conversations and activities in adjacent cellae were clearly audible. This wasn't necessarily a design flaw. Many clients were aroused by the sounds of sexual activity around them, and the brothel atmosphere was part of the experience. Curtains or wooden doors provided visual privacy while maintaining the acoustic environment that many patrons found exciting. Upper floor establishments catered to wealthier clientele with larger rooms, better furnishings, and enhanced privacy. These spaces featured wooden floors instead of stone, proper beds with comfortable mattresses, and windows that provided natural light and ventilation. Some included small reception areas where clients could relax with wine while negotiating services or waiting for their preferred companions. The most luxurious establishments occupied entire buildings designed specifically for elite sexual commerce. These domus featured multiple floors with specialized spaces, reception halls for entertainment and negotiation, dining rooms for elaborate banquets, private baths for ritual cleansing, and sleeping chambers furnished with imported furniture and expensive decorations. The House of the Veti in Pompeii, while not explicitly a brothel, included features that suggest it hosted high-end sexual entertainment. Public baths represented another crucial component of Rome's sexual geography. While technically separate from brothels, many balnea offered additional services that blurred the lines between hygiene and commerce. The heating systems, water supplies, and private chambers required for bathing also created ideal conditions for sexual encounters. Some baths maintained discrete areas where arrangements could be made, while others operated more openly as combination bathing and brothel facilities. Taverns and wine shops throughout the city provided venues for less formal sexual commerce. These establishments, known as popinae or copinae, served food and drink while offering opportunities for negotiating sexual services. The combination of alcohol and accessible location made them popular with working-class clients who couldn't afford the fees charged in dedicated brothels. The waterfront areas of port cities developed their own specialized sexual commerce infrastructure. Sailors arriving after months at sea created intense but temporary demand that required flexible business models. Temporary stalls, mobile services, and arrangements with tavern keepers near the docks provided sexual services without the overhead costs of permanent establishments. Military camps created unique geographic challenges and opportunities. While brothels couldn't officially operate within legionary bases, the civilian settlements that inevitably grew up outside camp walls, the canabae, included numerous establishments serving soldiers' needs. These semi-permanent structures could be quickly dismantled if military commanders decided to enforce moral regulations, then just as quickly rebuilt when enforcement relaxed. Provincial cities throughout the empire adapted Roman models to local conditions and cultures. Lugdunum in Gaul developed riverside districts that served both local clients and travelers following trade routes through the region. Antioch's sexual commerce was integrated with its famous entertainment district, where theaters, racing venues, and brothels created comprehensive leisure complexes. Alexandria's international character led to specialized establishments catering to different ethnic communities and their distinct sexual preferences. The legal framework governing these geographic arrangements was surprisingly sophisticated. Municipal laws designated specific streets or districts where sexual commerce was permitted while prohibiting it in others. Zoning regulations required minimum distances between brothels and temples, schools, or prestigious residences. Some cities imposed architectural requirements, maximum building heights, mandatory sanitation facilities, or specific construction materials that shaped the physical development of red light districts. The decline of these specialized districts began with the empire's economic troubles and accelerated under Christian influence, as municipal governments lost the resources to maintain urban infrastructure. The careful planning that had created functional red light districts broke down. The rise of Christianity brought moral objections to the geographic concentration of vice, leading to efforts to scatter or eliminate sexual commerce entirely. By the late imperial period, the sophisticated urban planning that had made Roman sex work so geographically integrated had largely disappeared, leaving only ruins and archaeological evidence of an approach to managing sexual commerce that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. The love letters discovered in a sealed chamber beneath a collapsed Pompeii brothel tell a story that would have scandalized contemporary moralists and challenges every assumption about the emotional lives of Roman sex workers. Written on wax tablets and papyrus scraps, they document a passionate 5-year relationship between Fortunata, a freedwoman courtesan, and Marcus Cecilius, a grain merchant who eventually abandoned his senatorial ambitions to live with her in what amounted to a common law marriage. These weren't the desperate protestations of a client's temporary infatuation or the calculated manipulations of a woman seeking financial security. They were genuine expressions of love, frustration, jealousy, and commitment between two people who had found something real in a world built on commercial transactions. "Your absence burns more fiercely than the fires of Vesuvius," Cecilius wrote during a business trip to Alexandria. "I count not days but heartbeats until I can hold you again." Roman law created seemingly insurmountable barriers to formal marriage between sex workers and respectable citizens, but human emotion proved remarkably creative in finding ways around legal obstacles. The key was understanding that Roman society recognized multiple forms of committed relationships that, while lacking full legal status, provided many of the practical benefits of marriage. Concubinage represented the most common solution for couples who couldn't marry legally. This arrangement, formalized through contracts and witnessed ceremonies, created a relationship that looked remarkably like marriage in everything but name. The concubine enjoyed protection from abandonment, rights to support and maintenance, and often inheritance provisions that secured her future. Her children, while technically illegitimate, could receive recognition and sometimes even inheritance rights from their father. Volumnia Lysandra exemplified how concubinage could evolve into something approaching true partnership. Originally a Greek slave trained as a courtesan, she became the exclusive companion of Senator Gaius Scribonius after he purchased her freedom. Their relationship lasted 18 years and produced 3 children whom Scribonius formally acknowledged. When he died, his will left her substantial property and granted freedom to any slaves she wished to manumit. Contemporary accounts describe their relationship as one of genuine affection and mutual respect that transcended its commercial origins. Some couples developed what modern observers might recognize as open marriages. The courtesan continued working with selected clients while maintaining a primary emotional and domestic relationship with one particular man. These arrangements required careful negotiation of boundaries, schedules, and financial responsibilities. The successful ones were built on genuine affection and practical compatibility rather than simple economic convenience. The emotional challenges of such relationships were substantial. Jealousy was inevitable when one partner continued selling sexual services to others, and managing these feelings required sophisticated emotional intelligence from both parties. Some couples developed elaborate rituals, special meals, private ceremonies, or secret languages that distinguished their personal relationship from the woman's professional activities. Long-term relationships also developed between sex workers and their regular clients that transcended simple commercial transactions. These relationships often began as business arrangements but evolved into genuine companionship as both parties found emotional satisfaction in their regular encounters. Some clients would book the same woman for months or years, providing steady income while receiving consistent companionship that filled emotional needs their marriages couldn't address. Lucius Flavius Maximus, a retired centurion living in Lugdunum, maintained a weekly relationship with the same courtesan for over a decade. Their arrangement included not just sexual services but shared meals, conversation about his military experiences, and emotional support during his struggles with what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress. When she retired from sex work, he provided the capital for her to open a small inn, and they remained close friends until his death. The children born from these relationships faced complex challenges and opportunities. While legally illegitimate, many received substantial support from their fathers and sometimes achieved social mobility that would have been impossible for their mothers. Some were formally adopted, others received excellent educations funded by their father's wealth, and a few even achieved political prominence despite their irregular origins. Female sex workers sometimes formed romantic relationships with each other, creating households that combined business partnership with emotional intimacy. These relationships were generally tolerated as long as they didn't interfere with commercial activities. Some couples worked together, pooling resources and sharing clients in arrangements that provided both economic security and emotional fulfillment. The retirement of sex workers often coincided with the formalization of long-term relationships that had developed during their working years. A courtesan, who had maintained a relationship with a particular client for several years, might transition to becoming his official concubine or even wife if legal obstacles could be overcome. These transitions required careful planning to ensure that both parties could adjust to the changed dynamics of their relationship. Marriage brokers who specialized in arranging unions for former sex workers became important figures in larger cities. These professionals understood the legal complexities, social challenges, and financial arrangements necessary to help retired sex workers transition to respectable married life. They maintained networks of potential husbands, often freedmen, foreign merchants, or men with their own complicated backgrounds, who were willing to overlook their brides' pasts. Some of the most successful transitions occurred when former sex workers married within their own social networks. A retired courtesan might marry a freedman who had worked as a brothel keeper, tavern owner, or merchant who had built his wealth serving the sex trade. These marriages were built on shared understanding of the industry's realities and mutual respect for the practical intelligence required to succeed in challenging circumstances. The legal reforms attempted under various emperors sometimes created opportunities for legitimizing these relationships. When citizenship requirements were relaxed or when new laws governing freedmen were enacted, some couples found windows of opportunity to formalize relationships that had previously existed in legal limbo. The surviving evidence suggests that genuine love and commitment could flourish even in the commercialized world of Roman sex work. While the legal and social obstacles were substantial, determined couples found ways to build lasting relationships that provided emotional fulfillment, practical security, and sometimes even social respectability. These relationships challenged simplistic assumptions about both Roman sexuality and the emotional lives of sex workers, revealing a complex world where commerce and affection often intertwined in ways that defied contemporary moral categories. The scar running from Claudia Turcha's left ear to her collarbone told a story that no amount of expensive cosmetics could completely hide. A Gallic trader, drunk on Falernian wine and furious about losing money at dice, had attacked her with a broken amphora when she refused to provide services he hadn't paid for. The incident occurred in one of Rome's better regulated brothels, with security present and legal protections theoretically in place. Yet Turcha nearly died, and her attacker faced no consequences beyond being ejected from the establishment. Violence was the constant shadow that followed Roman sex workers through every transaction, every client interaction, and every moment of their professional lives. While the industry had developed sophisticated systems for managing some risks, the fundamental vulnerability of selling intimate access to one's body in a society that viewed sex workers as inherently disposable created dangers that no amount of planning could completely eliminate. The spectrum of violence ranged from routine aggression that workers learned to expect and manage, to extreme brutality that could maim or kill. Most sex workers experienced regular verbal abuse, aggressive bargaining tactics, and clients who pushed physical boundaries during encounters. These minor forms of violence were so common that they were rarely reported or even discussed. They were simply occupational hazards that came with the territory. Physical violence typically escalated from disputes over payment, services, or time limits. Clients who felt cheated or who had consumed too much alcohol often became aggressive when their demands weren't met. The confined spaces of most brothel rooms made escape difficult, and the stigma attached to sex work meant that calling for help often brought more problems than solutions. Organized criminal elements represented another layer of threat. While Roman law regulated much of the sex trade, enforcement was inconsistent and corruption was widespread. Criminal gangs often extorted protection money from independent sex workers and smaller brothels, threatening violence against those who refused to pay. These organizations sometimes kidnapped women and forced them into prostitution, creating networks of sexual slavery that operated alongside the legal industry. The most vulnerable were foreign women, slaves, and those without family connections in Rome. A Germanic slave girl sold into prostitution had no legal protections, no family to avenge her mistreatment, and no resources to purchase better treatment. Criminal operators specifically targeted such women because their disappearance or death would attract minimal attention from authorities. Some establishments developed sophisticated protection systems that went far beyond simple security personnel. The house of Lucius Caecilius in Ostia employed former gladiators who were trained not just in combat but in recognizing the early signs of client aggression. These guards developed techniques for diffusing tense situations, removing problematic clients without creating public disturbances, and providing medical care for injured workers. The larger brothels often maintained relationships with local magistrates and law enforcement officials that provided some protection in exchange for regular payments and information about criminal activities in their districts. These arrangements weren't always reliable. Political changes could leave establishments vulnerable when their official protectors lost power, but they offered more security than smaller operations could achieve independently. Women developed their own informal protection networks based on shared information and mutual assistance. They warned each other about violent clients, shared techniques for recognizing dangerous situations before they escalated, and provided safe houses where women could recover from attacks or hide from particularly threatening individuals. These networks operated across different establishments and social levels, creating bonds of solidarity that transcended commercial competition. The legal system provided minimal protection for sex workers who were victims of violence. While assault was technically illegal regardless of the victim's profession, prosecuting attacks against prostitutes required witnesses, official complaints, and magistrates willing to take such cases seriously. Many attacks went unreported because workers feared retaliation from their attackers or punishment from authorities who blamed them for their own victimization. Some women learned to fight back effectively. Training in self-defense wasn't uncommon among sex workers, who recognized that their survival often depended on their ability to protect themselves. They carried concealed weapons, small knives, hairpins sharpened to deadly points, or vials of caustic substances that could blind attackers. A few became legendary for their ability to defend themselves and others, earning reputations that deterred potential aggressors. Religious protection played an important role in many women's survival strategies. Temples dedicated to Venus, Isis, and other deities associated with women's welfare sometimes provided sanctuary for sex workers fleeing violence. Some temples maintained their own security forces and could offer temporary protection while longer-term solutions were arranged. The economic aspects of violence created additional complications. Injured workers lost income while recovering, faced medical expenses they often couldn't afford, and sometimes suffered permanent damage that ended their careers prematurely. Some establishments provided disability support for workers injured on the job, but these benefits were limited and often came with obligations that kept women trapped in abusive situations. Client screening became an essential survival skill that experienced sex workers developed through hard-won experience. They learned to recognize signs of potential violence, certain types of nervous behavior, specific demands for unusual services, or attempts to negotiate prices or boundaries that suggested disrespect for agreed-upon limits. Many refused clients who showed these warning signs, even when it meant losing income. The most successful protection strategies combined multiple approaches: physical security, legal connections, economic resources, and social networks that could provide support during crises. Women who survived long careers in sex work typically became experts at reading people, managing dangerous situations, and building relationships that enhanced their safety. The violence that permeated Roman sex work wasn't just individual tragedy, it was systematic oppression that served broader social functions. The constant threat of violence kept sex workers dependent on male protectors, discouraged them from challenging exploitative arrangements, and reinforced their position at the bottom of social hierarchies. Understanding this violence is crucial to comprehending both the daily realities of sex work and the broader power structures that shaped women's lives in the ancient world. The character of Chrysis in Ovid's Amours wasn't just another literary figure. She was a cultural sensation that shaped how an entire generation of Romans thought about sex workers and desire. This fictional courtesan, clever enough to outwit senators and beautiful enough to drive poets to distraction, became more real to many readers than the actual women working in the Subura. Her witty repartee, elaborate schemes, and ultimate triumph over wealthy but foolish clients created a template for understanding sex workers that was simultaneously idealized and deeply influential. Roman literature didn't merely reflect attitudes toward sex work, it actively shaped them, creating myths and expectations that both elevated and constrained real women in the trade. The literary tradition established archetypes that persist even today: the golden-hearted whore who sacrifices everything for love, the scheming courtesan who manipulates powerful men, and the tragic figure destroyed by a society that uses and discards her. Plautus pioneered many of these themes in his comedies, where clever slave women and cunning courtesans consistently outwitted their social superiors through superior intelligence and practical wisdom. In Truculentus, the courtesan Phronsium manipulates 3 different lovers simultaneously, extracting gifts and money while maintaining complete control over all her relationships. These plays weren't subtle social commentary. They were popular entertainment that celebrated female agency and intelligence in ways that respectable society normally discouraged. The audiences who packed Roman theaters to watch these performances were seeing idealized versions of women they might encounter in real life, but the literary portrayals influenced how they interpreted those real encounters. A client might approach a courtesan expecting the wit and sophistication of a Plautine heroine, while the courtesan herself might adopt mannerisms and strategies she had observed in theatrical performances. Petronius pushed these literary conventions to their extremes in the Satyricon, creating a picaresque world where sexuality was simultaneously comic and profound, trivial and life-altering. His portrayal of the brothel scenes and sexual encounters was remarkably graphic for its time, but also deeply humanizing in ways that legal documents and moral treatises rarely achieved. His characters were neither idealized nor demonized. They were recognizably human figures struggling with universal desires and practical necessities. The elegiac poets created perhaps the most influential literary representations of sex workers through their portrayals of relationships with courtesans like Cynthia, Delia, and Corinna. These weren't necessarily real women but literary constructs that combined features of actual courtesans with poetic imagination. Yet their influence on real relationships was substantial. Men attempted to recreate the passionate, tormented dynamics described in elegiac poetry, while women adopted the behaviors and attitudes that poets celebrated. Propertius's relationship with Cynthia established the template for the courtesan as muse, intelligent, independent, sexually experienced, and emotionally unavailable. This literary archetype influenced actual courtesans who recognized that adopting similar personas could enhance their appeal to educated clients. Some learned to quote poetry, discuss philosophy, and embody the sophisticated femininity that elegiac verse had made fashionable. Historical writers like Tacitus and Suetonius used sex workers as symbols of broader social decay or imperial corruption. Their accounts of emperors' relationships with courtesans and prostitutes were designed to illustrate moral decline rather than provide accurate documentation of individual women's lives. Yet these historical narratives shaped public understanding of sex work's relationship to political power and social stability. The satirical tradition, exemplified by Juvenal and Martial, created some of the most complex and contradictory representations of sex workers in Roman literature. These writers simultaneously mocked and celebrated courtesans, presenting them as both victims and victimizers, objects of desire and sources of disgust. Their work captured the fundamental ambivalence that Roman society felt toward commercial sexuality. Martial's epigrams included numerous references to specific sex workers, some apparently real individuals whose names and characteristics were recognizable to contemporary readers. These brief poems functioned as a form of social media, spreading gossip, celebrating favorites, and creating public reputations that could enhance or destroy careers. Being mentioned favorably in a Martial epigram could significantly increase a courtesan's clientele and fees. The influence of literature on actual practices was substantial and bidirectional. Real courtesans studied literary models to develop their personas, while writers drew inspiration from actual women they encountered. This created a feedback loop where literature and reality continuously influenced each other, making it difficult to separate authentic historical practices from literary convention. Religious and philosophical texts also contributed to cultural representations of sex work, though often in more subtle ways. Stoic discussions of virtue and vice used prostitutes as examples of various moral principles, while mystery cult literature sometimes portrayed sacred sexuality in ways that influenced attitudes toward commercial sex. The visual arts complemented literary representations through frescoes, sculptures, and decorative objects that depicted sexual scenes and courtesans. The famous frescoes from Pompeii's brothels weren't just advertising, they were artistic statements that shaped aesthetic expectations and sexual practices. These images established visual vocabularies for understanding beauty, desire, and sexual technique that influenced both workers and clients. Foreign literary traditions also influenced Roman representations of sex work. Greek New Comedy provided models for clever hetairai, while Eastern texts introduced exotic sexual practices and philosophies that Roman writers adapted for their own purposes. This cultural exchange created increasingly sophisticated representations that drew from multiple traditions. The preservation and transmission of these literary works ensured that Roman attitudes towards sex work continued to influence later cultures long after the empire's decline. Medieval, Renaissance, and modern writers drew inspiration from Roman models, perpetuating archetypes and assumptions that originated in ancient literature. The cumulative effect of these cultural representations was to create a complex mythology around sex work that was simultaneously empowering and constraining. Literature provided models for agency, intelligence, and success that real women could emulate, but it also established unrealistic expectations and stereotypes that limited how society understood their actual experiences and needs. When the Great Fire of 64 CE devastated Rome, Emperor Nero's reconstruction efforts faced an unexpected challenge. The city's brothels and associated businesses employed nearly 40,000 people whose livelihoods had literally gone up in smoke. The crisis revealed just how deeply integrated sex work was into the Roman economic system, not as a marginal vice industry but as a major economic sector that supported vast networks of legitimate businesses and provided crucial services to the empire's commercial infrastructure. The tax revenue alone made sex work economically indispensable to Roman municipalities. The lustral tax collected from registered sex workers generated millions of denarii annually across the empire, funding everything from aqueduct maintenance to military equipment. In port cities like Ostia and Brundisium, brothel taxes often comprised 20 to 30% of total municipal revenue, making local governments dependent on the continued prosperity of their red light districts. But the economic impact extended far beyond direct taxation. The sex industry created demand for goods and services that supported hundreds of related businesses. Textile merchants supplied the elaborate costumes and bed linens that elite establishments required. Perfume makers developed specialized scents for different types of sexual encounters. Wine importers maintained exclusive relationships with high-end brothels that served premium vintages to wealthy clients. The construction industry built specialized architecture for sexual commerce, not just the obvious brothels and bathhouses, but also the discreet private dining rooms, soundproof chambers, and elaborate pleasure gardens that catered to elite tastes. These projects employed architects, decorators, engineers, and skilled craftsmen whose expertise in creating spaces for sexual entertainment became a specialized trade passed down through generations. Food service industries developed around the sexual economy's unique demands. Brothels needed reliable supplies of bread, wine, olive oil, and prepared foods for workers who had little time for cooking. Taverns and thermopolia that combined dining with sexual services required constant provisions and specialized menus designed to enhance rather than inhibit sexual performance. Some merchants built entire supply chains around aphrodisiac foods, exotic spices, and imported delicacies that wealthy clients expected as part of premium experiences. The cosmetics and personal care industries arguably owed their existence to sex workers' professional needs. The demand for effective hair dyes, skin whiteners, perfumes, and makeup created markets that supported international trade networks stretching from British tin mines used in cosmetics to Indian spice routes for exotic perfumes. Many cosmetic innovations developed for sex workers eventually spread to a respectable society, making the sex trade an unexpected driver of beauty industry development. Transportation services thrived on sex industry demand. Wealthy clients required discreet transport to and from brothels, leading to the development of specialized litter services and private carriage companies that guaranteed anonymity. The movement of high-end sex workers between cities created demand for comfortable, secure travel arrangements that contributed to the development of Rome's hospitality infrastructure. Banking and financial services adapted to serve an industry that dealt primarily in cash transactions but needed sophisticated money management. Some banks developed specialized accounts for sex workers, while informal lending networks provided credit for women purchasing their freedom, investing in property, or funding business ventures. The substantial cash flows generated by successful brothels made them important clients for money changers and commercial lenders. The integration was so complete that economic downturns in other sectors immediately affected the sex trade, and vice versa. When grain shortages drove up food prices, brothel attendants declined as disposable income decreased. Conversely, when military campaigns brought soldiers and their pay to a city, the resulting boom in sexual commerce stimulated growth across multiple economic sectors. This interconnectedness made sex work not a parasitic drain on the economy, but an integral component of Roman commercial life that both responded to and helped drive broader economic trends. The edict arrived on a cold morning in 325 CE, carried by imperial messengers who posted copies throughout the forum and read the proclamation aloud to gathered crowds. Emperor Constantine, newly converted to Christianity, had issued sweeping restrictions on prostitution that would begin dismantling an institution that had operated for over 8 centuries. But the end of Roman sex work wouldn't come through a single dramatic moment. It would unfold as a slow transformation that stretched across generations and left traces that persisted long after the empire itself had crumbled. The Christian emperors faced a practical dilemma. They could condemn prostitution on moral grounds, but they couldn't simply eliminate an industry that employed hundreds of thousands of people and generated massive tax revenues without creating economic chaos. Instead, they pursued a strategy of gradual restriction and transformation that slowly squeezed the life out of organized sex work while allowing alternative forms of sexual commerce to emerge. The first major blow came through taxation changes. Constantine tripled the lustral tax while simultaneously restricting the legal protections that had made the burden tolerable. Sex workers found themselves paying crushing fees for diminished rights, making legal registration economically unviable for all but the most successful courtesans. This forced much of the industry underground, where it became more dangerous and less profitable. Religious pressure intensified under Constantine's successors. Theodosius I ordered the closure of temples that practiced sacred prostitution, ending centuries of religious sexual commerce that had provided some of the industry's most prestigious and profitable positions. The cult sites that had legitimized sexuality as divine expression were converted to churches or simply abandoned, leaving their former hierarchies without institutional support or religious justification for their practices. Municipal authorities began rezoning red light districts, forcing brothels out of central locations and into increasingly marginal areas. The Subura, once the beating heart of Roman sexual commerce, was gradually converted to workshops and residential housing as brothel licenses were revoked and not renewed. This geographic marginalization made the remaining establishments harder for clients to find and easier for authorities to monitor and harass. The barbarian invasions accelerated the decline by disrupting the urban prosperity that had sustained commercial sex work. As trade routes became dangerous and cities shrank, the wealthy clientele that had supported elite courtesans disappeared. Military campaigns that had once brought soldiers flush with pay to major cities became desperate struggles for survival that left little room for entertainment expenses. Some aspects of Roman sex work adapted and survived by taking new forms. High-end courtesans reinvented themselves as marriage brokers, using their social connections and understanding of elite relationships to arrange unions between wealthy families. Others became entertainers who provided music, dancing, and sophisticated conversation while carefully avoiding activities that authorities could classify as prostitution. The institution of concubinage, always legally distinct from prostitution, became a refuge for relationships that had previously operated within the commercial sex industry. Many long-term arrangements between courtesans and their clients were formalized as concubinage contracts that provided legal protection while maintaining the essential dynamics of financial support in exchange for exclusive sexual access. In the provinces, local customs and reduced imperial oversight allowed modified forms of sex work to persist much longer than in Rome itself. Gallic and Germanic tribes had their own traditions of sacred sexuality and seasonal festivals that incorporated sexual commerce, and these practices gradually blended with or replaced Roman models. The economic networks that had supported Roman sex work found new purposes. The same supply chains that had provided cosmetics, luxury textiles, and exotic foods to brothels adapted to serve the growing Christian church's need for ceremonial objects, fine vestments, and imported incense. Former brothel managers became monastery administrators, applying their organizational skills to very different institutions. Standing in the ruins of a Pompeii brothel today, reading the graffiti scratched into walls 2,000 years ago, you encounter messages that could have been written yesterday. Restituta, you have a sweet soul. I was here with Droca, she was wonderful. Marcus loves Spendusa. These aren't the desperate scrawls of exploitation that moral reformers might expect, but rather the tender, mundane, and achingly human expressions of people seeking connection in a commodified world. The Roman approach to sex work reveals truths about human sexuality and social organization that transcend historical periods. Their systematic regulation, economic integration, and cultural acceptance created a laboratory for understanding how societies can manage sexual commerce when moral panic doesn't override practical considerations. The results were neither utopian nor dystopian, but remarkably complex and surprisingly functional. Perhaps most striking is how Roman sex workers achieved genuine agency within constrained circumstances. Despite legal limitations and social stigma, many built businesses, accumulated wealth, influenced politics, and created meaningful relationships. This challenges simplistic narratives about sex work that reduce it to either pure victimization or unproblematic empowerment. The Roman experience suggests that reality lies in the nuanced space between these extremes, a space where exploitation and opportunity, degradation and dignity can coexist in ways that demand careful analysis rather than reflexive judgment. The economic lessons are equally relevant. Roman integration of sex work into the broader economy created stability, generated substantial tax revenue, and supported vast networks of legitimate businesses. Modern debates about sex work regulation often ignore these economic realities, focusing on moral arguments while overlooking the practical benefits of treating sexual commerce as a legitimate industry subject to appropriate oversight and taxation. The Roman emphasis on harm reduction rather than elimination also offers insights for contemporary policy debates. Instead of attempting to suppress human desires that have persisted across every culture and historical period, Roman authorities focused on managing the inevitable consequences through regulation, taxation, and legal protections. This pragmatic approach produced better outcomes for both workers and society than the prohibition models that many modern societies continue to pursue. The stories that survive from Roman sex work ultimately remind us that behind every transaction, regulation, and moral debate were individual human beings seeking survival, dignity, and sometimes even love in whatever circumstances they found themselves. Their voices, preserved in letters, graffiti, and legal documents, speak across centuries to remind us that the fundamental questions about sexuality, power, and human connection that defined their world continue to shape our own. In the end, Roman sex work wasn't just about sex. It was about how societies organize desire, distribute power, and define the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The answers Romans developed to these challenges weren't perfect, but they were thoughtful, practical, and surprisingly humane. In our own ongoing struggles with these same eternal questions, we might find their voices worth hearing once again.